The Young and the Restless spoilers Wednesday full episodes, March 11th, 2026. Victor is wreaking havoc on Genoa, and the plot is becoming increasingly tedious, much to the dismay of many viewers. At the heart of this growing storm is Sienna Bacall, a mysterious and scheming figure whose arrival has begun to shift the balance of many people's lives. When Sienna finally approaches Noah Newman with the news she brings, the conversation is anything but ordinary. Noah has struggled to regain his composure after a series of emotional traumas, and Sienna's words sound like an impending disaster. Matt's arrival has caused chaos. Sienna and Noah want to return to LA for a stable life, but he's waiting there. Her warning clearly shakes Noah, as its implications extend beyond personal relationships and into the broader power struggle shaping Genoa. Sienna offers no comfort or reassurance. Kane and Lily had never been able to confront their difficulties directly. They preferred to overcome them through arguments. When Victor implemented his plan, Kane became deeply involved, and he needed to resolve it. Kane began to understand that the anger and resentment he had harbored for so long had only trapped him in the past. Lily, for her part, had become stronger and more independent, but the memories of the life they had built together still smoldered beneath the surface. When they finally faced each other again, the conversation wasn't explosive but deeply moving. Old wounds were acknowledged instead of ignored, and for the first time in a long time, both seemed ready to move forward instead of dwelling on the past. The reconciliation was cautious and fragile, but it carried the promise of something real. In a city where alliances constantly shift and trust is frequently broken, Kane and Lily's ability to rebuild their relationship offers a rare moment of hope amidst the turmoil. Victoria repeatedly urges her father to stop kidnapping Jack, to fight for himself. Victor Newman's actions are always controversial, even within his own family, but Victoria has spent years learning to navigate the moral gray areas as his daughter. Victor rarely acts foolishly. He has his own perfect plan, and he's willing to destroy it. When accusations begin to spread about Victor's latest actions, Victoria immediately takes a defensive stance. To outsiders, it may seem like she's blindly defending him, but in reality, Victoria's loyalty stems from a complex understanding of the man behind the empire. She knew that Victor had made enemies throughout Genoa, and she also knew that many of those enemies would be willing to distort any situation to make him look like a villain. For Victoria, protecting her father was not simply a matter of family loyalty. It was about maintaining the fragile power structure that preserved the Newman family legacy. However, the situation became far more tense when Nikki Newman began piecing together clues surrounding Jack Abbott's disappearance. Nikki had lived alongside Victor long enough to recognize subtle signs that something was amiss. Knowing that Victor was secretly pursuing another mysterious plan, suspicion immediately arose in her mind. Initially, she tried to dismiss the idea that he could be involved in something so extreme, but the timing of Jack's sudden disappearance made it impossible to ignore that hope. Nikki began to connect the dots with the keen intuition that helped her through countless crises before. The more she considered the situation, the clearer the answer became. Victor had done it again. He had orchestrated another kidnapping, and this time the victim was Jack Abbott, a man who was both Victor's rival and Nikki's longtime friend. Realizing this filled her with anger and disbelief. Nikki knew Victor was capable of ruthless decisions, but even she found it hard to accept that he could go this far again. The heavy mahogany coffee table in the center of the Abbott mansion's living room had been transformed into a desperate war room. Stacks of printed emails, maps of Genoa City's outskirts, and half-empty mugs of cold coffee cluttered the expensive surface. But the absolute focus of the room was a single, grainy 8x10 photograph. Diane Jenkins Abbott leaned over the image, her hands trembling so violently that her gold bracelets clinked against each other. Her eyes, red-rimmed and shadowed with days of sleepless agony, scanned the blurred pixels for the 100th time. Beside her, Kyle Abbott stood rigid, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. The disappearance of his father had stripped away his polished corporate veneer, leaving behind a terrified, furious son. "Look at the corner," Billy Abbott said, his voice, a low, gravelly rasp. He tapped a silver pen against the bottom right quadrant of the photograph. "Right there. It's not just a shadow. It's a reflection." Kyle leaned in closer, his brow furrowing as he followed his uncle's pen. The photograph had been delivered to Jabot anonymously, a cruel proof of life that showed nothing but a sliver of Jack's torn suit jacket against a backdrop of rusted corrugated metal and peeling gray paint. But Billy, operating on a lethal mixture of adrenaline and Abbott's stubbornness, had run the image through a high-contrast filter. "It's a window pane reflecting what's opposite the building," Billy explained, the tempo of his words accelerating with the thrill of the chase. "You see that shape? That curved rusted top? That's not just any industrial debris. That's a vintage copper distilling silo. Diane's breath hitched. She looked up, her eyes locking onto Billy's. "The old Miller Distillery out on County Road 9, Jack and I used to drive past it years ago. It's been abandoned for over a decade." "Exactly," Billy said, a fierce, triumphant light igniting in his eyes. "It's isolated off the main grid, and the property is tied up in a bureaucratic nightmare of a trust. Nobody goes out there. It's the perfect place to hide someone." "We need to go," Kyle demanded, already turning toward the foyer to grab his coat. "Right now. We call the police on the way. If my father is in that rotting building, I swear to God whoever took him is going to pay." "Wait, Kyle, we need to be smart about this," Diane cautioned, though she was already reaching for her purse, her maternal and wifely instincts warring with logic. "If we spook them, they could hurt Jack." "We don't have time to be smart," Kyle snapped, the raw emotion bleeding through his voice. "Every second we stand here debating, he's in danger. Let's move." They didn't know that their every desperate word, every triumphant deduction was being transmitted clearly through a microscopic audio bug planted beneath the lampshade of the end table. Across town, in the cavernous, dimly lit executive office of Newman Enterprises, Victor Newman sat behind his imposing desk like a spider at the center of a vast, invisible web. The air in the room was thick with the scent of expensive leather and absolute power. Victor's face, etched with decades of ruthlessness, remained completely impassive as the audio feed from the Abbott mansion played through a secure earpiece. He listened to Billy's deduction. He heard the exact moment hope flared in Diane's voice, and he felt a rare, fleeting prick of irritation. Asterisk, they are moving too fast times, Victor thought, his dark eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. Asterisk, William is actually using his brain for once. I underestimated their desperation. Asterisk. Victor reached out with a steady, age-spotted hand and pressed a button on his encrypted phone. It rang only once before his head of security answered. "Listen to me very carefully," Victor commanded, his baritone voice, a low, menacing rumble that brooked no argument. "The timeline has been compromised. The Abbotts have identified the primary holding location. You are to initiate the transfer immediately. I want Jack Abbott out of that distillery and moved to the secondary site before they even cross the city limits." "You got that." "Yes, Mr. Newman. We are moving him now. The secondary site is prepped and secure. Make sure the old site is scrubbed clean," Victor ordered coldly. "Leave nothing behind. Not a thread, not a footprint. When they arrive, I want them to find nothing but dust and their own foolish hopes. Do not fail me." Victor disconnected the call, a grim, satisfied smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Jack Abbott was a thorn in his side that he had finally plucked. The feud between the Newmans and the Abbotts had raged for decades, a bitter war of corporate espionage, stolen loves, and bruised egos. But this time, Victor was playing for absolute keeps. He needed Jack off the board, silenced and contained, while he executed the final phase of his hostile takeover of Jabot. But Victor knew that moving Jack was only half the battle. If the Abbotts found the distillery empty, they would immediately suspect interference. They would look to him. They always did. He needed an alibi, an ironclad, unimpeachable shield that would prove he was entirely disconnected from the afternoon's events. He dialed another number, his expression softening just a fraction as the line connected. Victor Darling Nicky Newman's elegant, melodious voice floated through the speaker. "To what do I owe this mid-afternoon pleasure? I'm in the middle of reviewing the Newman Media quarterly reports." My beautiful wife, Victor purred, his tone shifting effortlessly into that of a devoted romantic patriarch. "I find myself suddenly exhausted by the tediousness of these four walls. I want to see you. I want to take you to a late lunch at the athletic club. Just the two of us." Nicky let out a soft, surprised laugh. "Victor, it's nearly 2 in the afternoon. We both have a mountain of work, and you hate spontaneous lunches." "I love my wife," Victor countered smoothly, leaning back in his leather chair. "And I insist. Put the reports down, Nicky. Meet me in the main dining room in 20 minutes. I've already ordered your favorite champagne." There was a brief pause, a moment of mild suspicion from a woman who knew her husband's machinations better than anyone, but the charm offensive worked. "All right, Victor. You win. I'll see you in 20 minutes. Victor hung up the phone, his eyes cold and calculating. The pieces were moving exactly as he commanded. Meanwhile, Billy, Diane, and Kyle burst through the heavy glass doors of the Genoa City Athletic Club. Billy had left his SUV with the valet earlier that morning during a breakfast meeting, and it was the fastest vehicle they had access to. The lobby was bustling with the city's elite, a sea of tailored suits and designer dresses that felt entirely alien to the primal panic gripping the Abbott trio. "I'll grab the keys from the desk," Billy said, weaving through the crowd. "Kyle, go pull the car around to the loading zone so we don't get boxed in." "Hurry," Diane whispered, wrapping her coat tightly around herself, feeling as though she might shatter into a million pieces if she stood still for too long. As Kyle sprinted toward the side exit and Billy approached the valet podium, a familiar, regal figure stepped out of the private elevator. Nicky Newman, draped in an immaculate cream-colored cashmere coat, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, spotted Diane standing alone in the center of the lobby. Old rivalries flared instantly. Nikki had never cared for Diane Jenkins, viewing her as a manipulative interloper who had caused nothing but grief for the people of Genoa City. And recently, Jack's unexplained absence from several high-profile charity board meetings had left Nikki to shoulder the burden of the Foundation's work alone. Diane Nikki called out her voice, carrying the sharp, authoritative ring of a Newman. She marched across the marble floor, effectively blocking Diane's path to the door. Just the woman I wanted to see. Diane's eyes widened in horror. Asterisk, not now. Please God, not now. Asterisk, Nikki, I really can't talk. I'm in a desperate rush. I'm sure you are, Nikki said, her tone dripping with polite condescension. But you are going to stand here and explain to me where your husband is. Jack has missed 3 consecutive meetings for the Memorial Foundation. He isn't returning my calls and his assistant is giving me the runaround. It is completely unacceptable. Nikki, please, Diane begged, her voice cracking. She glanced frantically toward the valet stand where Billy was currently arguing with a new attendant who couldn't find the right key fob. It's family business. Jack is... He's indisposed. I will have him call you the moment he can. Indisposed Nikki arched a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, stepping closer her presence an immovable object. That is the same vague excuse I've heard for days. If Jack is trying to pull out of the Foundation's funding commitments, he needs to have the decency to tell me to my face, not hide behind his wife. He isn't hiding, Diane snapped, her frayed nerves finally snapping. You have no idea what is going on, Nikki. Get out of my way. The raised voices drew the attention of nearby patrons. Billy, having finally secured the keys, rushed over, stepping between the 2 women. Nikki, back off, Billy warned, his voice low and dangerous. Diane told you we are in a hurry. Leave it alone. Billy Nikki scoffed, looking him up and down with disdain. Always playing the white knight. I am simply trying to conduct business. But clearly the Abbott family is unraveling as usual. I don't have time for your theatrics anyway. I am meeting my husband for a romantic lunch, and I refuse to let your chaotic energy ruin my afternoon. Victor is here, Billy asked, a sudden chill running down his spine. He is waiting for me in the dining room, Nikki said proudly, checking her diamond-encrusted watch. He insisted on a private, spontaneous lunch. So if you'll excuse me, I have better things to do than interrogate a brick wall. Nikki turned on her heel and glided toward the dining room doors, completely unaware of the catastrophic delay she had just caused. She had no idea that her demand for answers, her petty insistence on Foundation business, had eaten up 12 agonizing minutes. 12 minutes. Miles away in the damp, decaying bowels of the Miller distillery, those 12 minutes were the difference between salvation and damnation. Jack Abbott sat bound to a heavy wooden chair, his wrists raw and bleeding from pulling against industrial zip ties. The air in the room was thick with the smell of rust mold and his own dried sweat. He had lost track of how many days he had been down here. The darkness was absolute, save for a single sliver of gray light bleeding through a crack in the boarded-up window above him. He was tired. So incredibly tired. But his mind was sharp, fueled by the thought of Diane's smile, of Kyle's future, of his family. He knew Billy wouldn't stop looking. He knew his brother's relentless nature would eventually crack the code. Suddenly, the heavy iron door at the end of the corridor groaned open. Jack's head snapped up. Footsteps. Fast, heavy, urgent. Not the usual slow, arrogant pacing of his guard bringing a meager ration of water. This was a tactical march. 3 men dressed in unmarked black tactical gear flooded into the room. They didn't speak. They moved with terrifying practiced efficiency. What is this? Jack croaked, his voice raw and hoarse. Where are you taking me? One of the men stepped behind him, a black canvas hood in his hands. Before Jack could scream, the hood was yanked down over his head, plunging him into suffocating, terrifying darkness. Rough hands grabbed his shoulders, slicing the zip ties, securing him to the chair, only to immediately bind his hands behind his back with heavy steel cuffs. Move, a voice barked, devoid of any emotion. Jack was hauled to his feet. His legs, stiff from days of immobility, buckled, but the men dragged him forward, their grips like iron vises on his biceps. He was hauled up a flight of concrete stairs, the cold, biting wind of the outside world hitting him for a brief, disorienting second before he was shoved violently into the back of a waiting van. The doors slammed shut with a sickening thud. The engine roared to life, tires spinning in the dirt as the vehicle tore away from the property. Lying on the ribbed metal floor of the van, Jack squeezed his eyes shut beneath the hood, a single tear slipping down his cheek. Asterisk. They were moving him. Which meant they were close. Billy, Diane. Please, don't stop. Asterisk. Back at the distillery, the remaining operative pulled a pressurized canister from his duffel bag. Within minutes, the room was doused in industrial-grade bleach, the pungent chemical odor eradicating any trace of human DNA, sweat, or scent. The chair was broken down and tossed into the back of a secondary truck. By the time the operative drove away, the room looked exactly as it had for the last 10 years, empty, rotting, and forgotten. 20 minutes later, Billy's SUV tore down County Road 9, kicking up a massive cloud of gravel and dust as it swerved onto the overgrown property of the Miller Distillery. The vehicle hadn't even come to a complete stop before Kyle threw his door open, sprinting toward the rusted main structure. "Dad," Kyle screamed, his voice echoing off the desolate metal silos. "Dad, are you in here?" Billy and Diane were right behind him. Billy kicked the weathered wooden door of the main building, the rotten wood splintering and giving way easily. They rushed into the cavernous space, flashlight beams cutting through the thick swirling dust. They searched frantically, tearing through piles of debris, kicking open rusted barrels, their voices growing more hoarse and desperate with every empty room they cleared. Finally, they reached the basement level. Kyle pushed open the heavy iron door, his flashlight sweeping across the concrete floor. The room was utterly bare. But the air told a different story. Diane gagged, covering her mouth with her scarf. "Oh my God, it smells like..." Bleach Billy finished, his heart plummeting into his stomach. He walked slowly to the center of the room, his flashlight illuminating a clean, circular patch on the otherwise filthy floor. He knelt down, his fingers brushing the damp concrete. "It's wet. They just cleaned it." "No," Kyle whispered, the word tearing from his throat in a choked sob. He fell to his knees beside Billy, his hands gripping his hair. No, we were right here, we had it." Diane collapsed against the door frame, sliding down to the cold floor, tears streaming freely down her face. The crushing weight of the dead end pressed down on them, suffocating the brief, bright hope they had harbored just an hour ago. "We were too late," Billy said, his voice hollow, staring at the empty space where his brother had undoubtedly been held. He slammed his fist into the concrete, the pain barely registering over the agonizing frustration. "Someone tipped them off. Or they saw us coming. The trail is gone. It's completely cold." They sat in the toxic, bleach-scented silence, the realization washing over them that the search for Jack Abbott had just become infinitely more complex and infinitely more dangerous. The clues they had relied on were now useless. They were back at square one, staring into the abyss. Miles away in the sunlit, opulent dining room of the Genoa City Athletic Club, Victor Newman raised a crystal flute of vintage Dom Perignon. Across the table, Nikki smiled warmly, her earlier irritation with the Abbotts completely forgotten in the glow of her husband's undivided attention. "To us, my darling," Victor said, his voice smooth as silk, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a picture-perfect display of affection. "And to a peaceful, uninterrupted afternoon." "To us," Nikki agreed, clinking her glass against his, entirely oblivious to the fact that her brief petty argument in the lobby had been the exact shield her husband needed to execute his dark agenda. Victor took a slow sip of the champagne, the taste of victory sweet on his tongue. He had done it. Jack was secured in a subterranean bunker miles outside of the city, a place so remote and heavily guarded that not even William Abbott's desperate ingenuity could pierce it. He had created the perfect alibi, using his own wife as an unwitting pawn to run out the clock on his enemies. He looked out the window of the club, watching the city move below him. He had confused his rivals. He had broken their momentum. Victor Newman remained, as always, the undisputed king of the board. Back in the cold, dark basement of the distillery, Billy slowly rose to his feet. He looked at Diane's shattered expression and then at Kyle, who was staring at the floor with a terrifying cold fury settling into his features. Billy didn't know how Victor had done it. He didn't know that Nikki's seemingly random interception was the fatal blow to their timeline. But looking at the empty, bleached room, a dangerous fire ignited in Billy's chest. "We don't stop," Billy said, his voice echoing in the empty chamber, a solemn vow forged in the darkness. "They moved him because we got close, which means they are scared. We tear this city apart. We tear Victor Newman apart if we have to, but we are bringing Jack home."